Hi there, I'm Jacob McCourt. I am a content creator. I host 2 podcasts and a show on Twitch. I will tell you all about that at the end of the show. If you want to find me on the internet, you can do so at Jacob McCourt, JACOBMCCOURT. I'll leave all that to the end, but in the meantime, I want to tell you about one of my favorite games of all time, Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Knuckles. Arguably 2 games, but I'll get into that. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Knuckles, developed by the Sega Technical Institute and published by Sega originally for the Genesis, but it's literally out on all of the systems. If you don't know what Sonic the Hedgehog is, I don't know how that's possible, but Sonic the Hedgehog 3 is a platformer that really defined the Genesis. It really defined the Genesis because of the speed that you could play with. Sonic was a very fast character, and there was the Nintendo and Sega wars back in the day, and really the defining difference between Sonic and Mario is that you gotta go fast as Sonic. And you would jump around, bounce around, go fast, and that's what made this game kinetically really fun to play, is that although you moved very fast, you were always in control of your character. It is technically the 3rd and 4th game in the series, because it's really 2 games in one. You take the cartridge, there's really 2 cartridges. So you have a bottom cartridge that opens up with a lock-on mechanic on it, where you could put in either Sonic 2 or Sonic 3 into, that would unlock the ability to play Knuckles in your Sonic the Hedgehog 2 or Sonic the Hedgehog 3 game. If you didn't put another Sonic the Hedgehog cartridge on top of Sonic and Knuckles, it actually was its own standalone game. I'm not going to talk about Sonic and Knuckles, maybe I'll leave it for someone else to tackle, but my biggest thought about the game is that it had, in my opinion, the weakest opening of the 4 mainline Genesis Sonic games. In Mushroom Hill Zone, even though the boss fight for that was very good, the level was a little bit bland, and it didn't give you that same comfort that you'd get from a, generic green Sonic intro level. A little bit about the development of the game. The first Sonic game was developed by Sonic Team, headed up by Yuji Naka. And shortly after the release of that game in 1991, the developers from Sonic Team, Yuji Naka, Yasuhara, were basically like, I don't want to do this for Sonic Team anymore in Japan. I guess the original Sonic the Hedgehog, it took a long time to come out. The creators of the game weren't happy with their salary, so they essentially moved over to California to the Sega Technical Institute, which was headed up by Mark Cerny, who is a name that you probably recognize. He's the architect of a few of the PlayStations and a creator of many game franchises that are, still talked about to this day, including Marble Madness, Knack. The list goes on and on. In the game, you can play as a couple different characters, or a couple different combinations of characters. You can play as Sonic and Tails, you can play as Sonic or Tails individually, and you can play as Knuckles. And each character had their own unique ability that makes them play a little bit differently than the rest. Sonic, gotta go fast, he's all about running and jumping, and then doing his little spin dash. Everyone has the spin dash, but Sonic is really like your generic character, whereas Tails moved a little bit slower, and you have the ability to fly. There's a level in the game called the Marble Garden Zone, and in that zone there's tons of verticality. And with Tails, instead of rushing your way up a very steep incline, you could just fly. It wasn't unlimited, but you could fly up it. And then Knuckles had the ability to glide and then crawl up walls. So, depending on what character you used, each of the levels had multiple different paths. And if you want something fun to look at, go on Reddit, check out Big Levels Sonic the Hedgehog 3, and it'll actually show you how large some of the levels are in kind of one image and some of the different paths you can take. That's what was cool about this game compared to some of the other Sonic the Hedgehog games, is there was a lot of replayability, not only because you could play as multiple different characters, but also that within each level, and there were around 10 levels that you could play within, there were different paths for each. Each level had its own unique character as well. When I think back to Sonic the Hedgehog 3, there's 2 things that immediately come to mind to me, and that's first Angel Island Zone, which had a super groovy soundtrack. It is a opening level, so it's green, as most of the Sonic levels are. It had great robotic enemy design. The boss fights are cool, and not only that, but Robotnik burns the whole island to the ground halfway through. And so you're making your way through this green level, and then he burns the whole thing to the ground, and for the rest of your playthrough, multiple acts in Sonic games, the whole thing is just on fire, which is super cool. Not for the environment, climate change is real, but in the design, the art design and art direction, it was cool. Carnival Night Zone is also one thing that usually comes to mind for me, as the music is just like very classic carnival music, but almost kind of eerie and scary. Not only that, but there are these barrels that are in the level that you have to jump on, and you kind of turn around them to go up in the level, and the levels are so large and you only have 10 minutes to beat them. Those levels haunt me, but not only from like a difficulty perspective, but just because of the music and some of the traps that could really get you. On the music, before I talk about it, there was a conspiracy for a very long time that Michael Jackson, who has a long history of allegations against him, thought I would call that out before speaking about this. There was a conspiracy that he was involved in the soundtrack of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, because there were uncredited tracks that for 20 years since the game's release, folks have just denied that that he was involved in it. I think just recently, a few years ago, someone finally said, like, yeah, he was involved in that he gave, like, ideas or stems for music to the development team or the musicians that made the game, and that's how he was kind of involved in it. He had a game on the Genesis called Moonwalker that had some funky music to it, but that was a mystery that maybe was just solved in the last couple years. Something I also think about when I think of Sonic the Hedgehog are the cool bonus levels. There are two different kinds of bonus levels in this game. There's one type of bonus level that you find these giant rings hidden throughout the levels. You jump into them, and then you move from like a 2D space to a very like rudimentary 3D space where you'll essentially direct Sonic around, like in a maze-like fashion where you just kind of turn him as he keeps moving forward, and you'll run over blue balls, turning them red. And your goal is to turn all of the spheres in the level to red, and that way you get a Chaos Emerald, collect 7 of them, and you can really unlock the true ending of the game. But this is one of my favorite parts of the game. If you can give me a game of just this, I'd be very happy, like in an arcade or something, because as you turn these balls red, you give yourself more obstacles that make it more difficult. You can figure out, like, there's some advanced techniques where you can make your way around the outside. Imagine that there's a 4x4 grid of spheres. You can make your way around the outside, and then it turns everything on the inside into rings, which are the currency in a Sonic the Hedgehog game. Just thinking about it just makes me happy. The other type of bonus level is on the checkpoint. So imagine halfway through the level, there's this little pole that you run through, it turns around, and then there's kind of some magical dust that appears above the checkpoint. You jump into it, and you're transported into a life-size gumball machine. And I talked about how, kinetically these games all feel so amazing. I think that the gumball machine is kind of the epitome of like what these games feel like to jump around and bounce around, because you have these little, imagine they're pinball bumpers on the side of this column, and then at the top of the column there's a gumball machine that you can keep hitting to get gumballs to come out, and each of these gumballs is like, here's a power, here's some rings, here's like a bumper that's an actual ball that you're gonna bounce off of. Eventually, you will run out of bumpers on the side, and you'll, fall out of the level back into the regular level. But truly, like 10 or 15 seconds of like wonderful kinetic energy that you just experience. The game is so good to play. Really, nothing beats bouncing off a rock or a platform that you're destroying, hearing the sound it makes, and envisioning. It's almost like that sound is the sound of rumble, and it just feels so good to do, even though you're not, at least on the Genesis, feeling the rumble in your hands as you're destroying rocks or platforms or jumping on robots. You can also get power-ups that do some cool stuff. If you're Sonic, for example, you can get a bubble that allows you to bounce. You can get a fire little shield that goes around Sonic that allows you to like fireball your way across the map. There's a lightning power, which allows you to, like, if you double tap the jump button, it allows you to do this little hop. and also attracts all the rings into you. Just thinking about it, you can tell the excitement in my voice while I talk about it. And then as far as the game goes, like a story path, there is... I don't want to say there's one defined path. If you play as Sonic or Knuckles, the bosses that you face are actually a little bit different, and the ending, actually varies just a smidge depending on the character that you select. Sonic and Tails have a different ending than Knuckles that I won't get into. But having a save system in this game was incredibly useful, because that is not a thing that is in all Sonic games. So super, super useful to have. And then once you kind of play the game, there is a multiplayer mode, weirdly enough, in this one, where you can play with one other player. It's not great, but it is something that, you can play with another player, and it's split screen, and there are these special levels where you're essentially racing against another character just to see who can get to the end of the level first. It's like a modified version of the levels from the kind of main game. So fun to do if you've got somebody over and, you've got your Genesis out. You're like, hey, do you want to play 20 minutes of this? It doesn't have a lot of staying power, but I think that it's a fun thing that I'm glad is included. The last thing I want to say on this is just a short story about how much I think about this game. I did a garage sale back when I was, probably 16 or 17 years old at my parents' house, and I had this official player's guide to Sonic the Hedgehog by Jason R. Rich. And as a kid, I must have, carried this book around with me and just read it a whole bunch. And it just had, tips and tricks on how to beat some of the Genesis games for Sonic. I sold it at that garage sale, I'm sure for like $1. And there are very few things in my life that I regret giving up or giving away. But that is one of the two things that I regret selling in garage sales that I wish that I could find. If you have an official player's guide to Sonic the Hedgehog by Jason R. Rich, it is a purple book. It is a little bit larger than, it's probably about the size of a hardcover book, but it's soft cover, and it's probably got, a couple hundred pages in it. If you have this player's guide and you want to talk about letting it go to someone who will appreciate it forever, please send me a message on Twitter at Jacob McCourt, JACOBMCCOURT. I am trying not to pay a bunch of money to get my own used copy of it, so if you have one, please reach out, let me know. The other thing that I regret selling is I'm a big Roller Coaster Tycoon fan, and I had boxed copies of the original PC versions, as well as Prima strategy guides for them, and I sold them all to someone for, I'm sure, like $10. So those are the two things that I regret selling that I wish I still had. So if you have either of those things, you know where to find me on Twitter. Thank you for listening to this episode of Side Quests. Again, I'm Jacob McCourt. I host many different things. I've been on a few shows on the CPOV network with Matt, aka Stormageddon. You can find my podcasts on all places where podcasts are found. The first is called the Left Behind Game Club. It is a video game book club podcast that tries to be positive as well as informative and a little bit funny, where we're mostly positive about games that are at least a year old. We have over 120 episodes that you can jump in the feed and find a game you like and see if you agree with us. I would encourage you to do that, as well as a seasonal video game movie podcast that Matt, aka Stormageddon, is actually the opening voice for. I host that with my two friends, Travis Colnut and Katie Lesbrance, who've both been on this podcast, I think multiple times, but you can find that, again, that's Cutscenes. It is seasonal. We are on hiatus right now, but if you're listening to this when it comes out, we should have Season 3 coming out imminently. If not, it's already out. The last thing that I host, which is on hiatus right now, is Video Game Trivia. When it is live, I do it weekly on Twitch at Jacob McCourt. It is an hour of adversarial video game trivia between other content creators on the internet. Again, Matt has been on the show. Case from CPOV has been on the show. So ensure, if you like video games, it's a super fun time. Video game trivia, Wednesday nights, Eastern, 9 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. And that's all my things. Thank you for listening, and happy gaming.